Hi guys, what's going on? Zura over here. It is good to be back at creating more content. For some of my loyal supporters, it has been a minute, but hopefully I can get back at making content more consistently. In case you're wondering, there had been some changes in my job situation. Now I am back at teaching chess full time pretty much and play myself as well, do all things related to chess. I did play few tournaments recently. One of them finished up this past weekend, which I thought I would start sharing with you. Let's see. The tournament I have in mind was played at Texas Chess Center, the first FIDE tournament that they had. I was the first seed, but I still think there were few interesting games that I played. Let's jump right into it. First game I actually played against my student Aditya, um, and we started with some Queen's Indian Petrosian variation. So after b6, white goes a3 with the idea of controlling the b4 square. The pre-context of this is actually this is the file that we have looked at it together, this Petrosian variation. So facing my own preparation was an interesting phenomenon, to say at least. Bishop b7, knight c3, black goes d5. Basically, white wants to get the control of the center here and push d5. If black does not play d5 themselves, for example, if bishop e7, then white can go d5 and grab the space early on. So black goes d5 themselves, c takes d5, and I decided to take with the e pawn and go in a more standard isolated queen's pawn slash hanging pawns Queen's Indian type of positions, basically e d5. The main line here is knight takes d5, and usually then white goes queen to c2 and something like knight d7. White pushes e4, usually captures, and then c5. Either immediately c5 or bishop e7 short castle and then c5 is some of the main lines in this position. However, I didn't want to go for knight d5 since we had looked at it together. So cd5, e d5, bishop goes to g5, bishop goes to e7. Aditya here played e3, which looks like a very natural move. Afterwards, we looked at it together, and white's main continuation here apparently is queen goes to a4 check, including this check, and black will have to commit either to c6, which would delay black's development here by pushing c5 later on, knight d7. Well, you may ask, like, but didn't white lose a tempo with queen a4? Well, black will also lose a tempo here in case they play c6, and then if they decide to push c5. Otherwise, that c6 pawn will become a target. If knight bd7, there is actually an interesting idea here, I believe, e3, and if black goes short castle, bishop a6, trading light squared bishops and weakening black's position here. Long term, I think this might be just a tiny bit better for white, structural advantage basically. All right, back to the game. E3 is what happened, short castle, bishop d3. I play a6 here, a little bit of a move order switch here. Knight bd7 probably seems most natural here, and then going for an immediate c5. However, I decided to start with a6 here, short castle, then knight bd7, and now white plays rook to c1. Rook c1 also seems a very natural continuation here. I go c5, which is a pretty standard setup here in the Queen's Indian positions for black. Queen's Indian as well as Queen's Gambit decline positions probably. Now I think it's the first position where white is kind of out of book here. It's not an unfamiliar, like completely unfamiliar position, I'm sure, for either of us. It's a pretty standard position with with white having the pawn majority in the center, but black also balances it with c5 and d5 pawn here. So there are a few moves. Computer, I think, is suggesting going bishop f5 immediately. Bishop b1 is also a move to set up this standard battery on the b1 h7 diagonal, bishop and queen battery, basically. But bishop f5 is an interesting move. It actually creates the threat of capturing on d7 immediately, because if now queen captures d7, then knight a4 wins the pawn here. b6 will be hanging, and then c5, I think, it drops on the next move. After bishop captures d7, most likely black will have to take with the knight. However, then white trades the dark square bishop as well, and let's say after rook takes d7, d takes c5. Now the d5 pawn is hanging, so black will have to capture on c5 with the knight, which will result in having an isolated queen's pawn on d5 and passive bishop on b7. For example, after like knight d4, white undoubtedly should be slightly better here, maybe even more than slightly. And in isolated queen's pawn side that usually keeps that pawn tends to get an activity, but clearly there is no activity from the black side, and they will have to suffer passive defending for a long time, I would assume here. Back into the game. Now, what happened into the game was queen e2. I think queen e2 is a little bit of an inaccuracy here. White plays this too much based on general considerations here. Queen on e2, I think, doesn't accomplish much, and black gets required time to start pushing now queenside pawns, c4, bishop b1, and now b5. Again, very standard idea for black in the Queen's Indian positions. Black gains the space on the queen side and aims at pushing this c4, b5, then potentially protecting the b5 pawn, and then a4, a5, b4, annoying this knight on c3 and kicking it away. Now, what does white do here? White decides to go knight d2. Computer was suggesting something along the lines knight e5, but it's already around zeros. Probably black takes there, knight d7. Now, this is a weird pawn structure. Normally, if pawns are connected, this would be in black's favor. However, now black has a backwards pawns on d5, so it's not going to be straightforward. For example, bishop f4, and there is still like rook fd1, queen e6, and unclear play. If knight takes e5, there is always bishop h7 here. So after takes queen h5, takes on e5, and I think we have now an interesting dynamics here. Black has two pawns in the center, and white has in return pawns on h2 and e3, right? However, these pawns are safely blocked, and not sure which one would be better here, bishop pair or bishop and the knight. I would think actually bishop and the knight, because this dark light squared bishop is probably not much of a piece. Instead of going knight e5 here, Aditya decides to go knight d2, preparing f3 e4, which definitely should be critical, but as we will see in the game, I don't think white gets enough time there. So queen goes to b6, basically putting the pressure on this d4 pawn if white decides to potentially play f3 e4, which is what happened in the game, and also protecting this b5 pawn so I can get a5 b4 going as fast as possible. Now that is pretty interesting actually. That I was going to go a5 b4 here immediately, which is what computers suggest that has to be played here, and then b4 immediately. Knight will most likely have to retreat on e2, and now the e4 push will not be as powerful. I can try maybe go bishop a6, some kind of c3 idea here. I don't think actually it works like immediately, but maybe rook e8, or this move f e4 is actually not an option right now. I might have knight g4 immediately, even. Yep, I think knight g4 and takes here. You cannot take here immediately, because if you then check queen g6, and I'll have bishop e3 and bishop d2 followed. If you play queen f5, I believe something similar may happen here. Takes, and I can try on g6 and then takes on d2. So I think I end up being a few pawns up there. Cool. Instead, for some reason, after my opponent played f3, I decided to go rook f to e8. I got too attached to this idea of basically stopping e4 at any cost, and I tried to kill basically two birds at a time, stop his counterplay, and also then get my own going here. Stopping his counterplay, I mean stopping e4 by putting the pressure on d4 pawn here, and after white moves queen f2, I decide to go h6, bishop retreats back, and then knight goes to f8. Now this knight is coming to e6 to, as I said, put more pressure on the d4 pawn. Computer does not like this too much. Computer says that black had to get a5 b4 counterplay going immediately. Now this knight f8 basically works in white's favor, because now white has enough time to prepare e4. So my opponent went for an immediate e4, which is actually a mistake. The correct move was probably taking measures against my counterplay here, which is what ended up happening into the game. And then d4 pawn is basically has become too weak there. I think king h1 would make a lot of sense here, then trying to push e4 on the next move. So for example, a5, then going e4, now knight e6 to attack probably this d4 pawn, knight e2 to protect it, and then we continue playing. I think positions should objectively be still around equal here, whether black decides to push b4 here, or even moves like knight h5 might be a possibility here to try to basically put the knight on f4, one of the knights on the next move. But a very complex position. I think this could still be anyone's game, basically. One inaccuracy, and the tables may turn. Well, my opponent decides to go e4 here, which I think is a little rushed. It should be, I think, a good example for the players playing this position with white. White does not want to rush this push, because if the center, one of the central pawns drop here, that's not gonna be fun. Basically, it may go wrong very easy here. So that's what happens. Knight goes to e6 to attack the d4 pawn. White plays e5 to attack my knight. And little trick that I had prepared here was knight takes d4, e takes f6, and then bishop goes to c5. Now this queen and the king are very badly placed. I'm threatening to go knight e2 check, or even knight takes f3. And if king h1, which is what happened into the game, now knight f5 suddenly traps the queen. Queen has nowhere to go. I was actually considering here that white would probably sacrifice the queen for 3 pieces, In that case, if that's what white wants to do, probably b4 would be the good place to start. After c takes b3, king moves on the side, and I will still win the queen here. However, this b4 forced me to open up basically my pawn structure there, open up my queen side. After take something like bishop f2, bishop takes f2, queen f6, knight d4. Now white has 3 minor pieces for the queen, which would normally be better. However, I do have 3 pawns here, so that should be worth something. I'll probably play b2 and still have the initiative here, considering all those pawns. But it wouldn't be unimaginable or unfathomable thing here that white gets basically these pawns and manages to set up the blockade, and black is not able to infiltrate basically. I think practically this could be quite tricky still. So instead what white does here is king goes to h1, but now after knight f5 I will win a queen, and then I'll have this a very strong pawn structure. Basically, if I go d4, let's say not knight takes c4 is what happened in the game, but let's say bishop takes f5, takes there, and now queen takes f6, then bishop will have to retreat, and I'll get d4, d3 also going. So that should be pretty difficult for white. So instead, white takes knight takes c4 here to give the queen an escape square. D takes c3. Now queen goes to c2. There is a queen h7 threat, so I have to protect my knight with g6. I can take on h4 immediately. Now this bishop will retreat back, bishop f2. And this was probably the position where I spent a lot of time and still didn't find the right continuation. I was thinking how to convert basically in the best way possible here, and I did not choose the right way. I captured the bishop on f2 because thinking that if I go knight e3, which obviously was the move that I was seriously considering, bishop takes e3, I thought rook c to d1, and once I take queen f6, then knight e4, and white will force now opposite colored bishop transition. Basically, if I go queen e7, for example, then knight d6 and takes on b7. But I figured that during the game that I probably should take bishop e4 here, then f takes e4, and I go probably queen e6. And there is no doubt that black should be better. I was just not sure how much better. And I thought if white somehow gets bishop a2, b3, it might be annoying on the a2 g8 diagonal, my f7 pawn. However, I think this was all ghosts. Playing bishop a2 and b3 will be almost impossible in view of bishop a2. There will be queen e4, and 2 pawns is simply too much, even for the opposite colored bishops positions. So instead of going knight e3 here, I take on f2, queen takes f2, and then capture that pawn on f6. White goes knight to e4, I move queen to e5, and white plays queen to b6, attacking my bishop and also threatening knight f6. I think the last accurate move black needs to make here is just simply rook e7, protecting both, and then after knight f6 check, simply king g7. Now I think my opponent originally wanted to go knight g4 there to attack my queen, and then also maintain this threat of queen f6, but I can just go queen d4 and force the queen trade, after which I'm just pawn up in the end game, and white's minor pieces are very much discoordinated. So what ended up happening in the game is bishop captures f5. Now I capture on f6 for simplification reasons, forcing the trading queens, and I just have a pawn up rook endgame, which should be easily winning. If bishop retreats back, I probably play rook d8, and then rook e2, rook d2 will be deadly threats. White plays bishop e4, captures king to e5. Now king g7 will also be an option. Probably now this e4 pawn is hanging. There are a few more moves that took place into the game. Basically, I played rook d8, then I think second rook to d7. Eventually, I captured this pawn on e4, and after rook d2, game ended in the next basically 10 moves or so from this position. I won the b2 pawn, and then c pawn will be decisive. So yeah, that was the first round that I wanted to show. I think a very interesting game in a sense of the middle game play here, and hopefully instructive. It was definitely instructive for me, and hopefully for you as well. All right, I will see you on the next one. Cheers.